shut everything up, sorry.
Yes. See, everyone's gone quiet now. That means we have to start.
Hi, Mr. Jeffrey. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. Okay, that means
It's a seat for the
Sorry.
time.
He's got to deny.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's a photo.
Right. Ah, okay. Just need a pop shield.
You don't have to leave the light on.
No.
I know there's alcohol in that glass.
All right, shall we get going? Okay, all right. So this is creepy. If you're in the wrong room, feel free to creep out. My name is Kat Day. I am here because I am one of the. I work on the horror podcast Pseudopod. Hopefully there's a couple of people at least in here who have heard of Pseudopod.
Yeah.
So that's good, fantastic. And so I spend all my time kind of reading short horror, trying to, arguing with the other editors, trying to work out what we're going to run there. And then we've got a fantastic panel of other writers for you here. And we're going to be just talking about, how do we get creepy elements into stories? So we have got Catherine Cavendish, who is the author of 20 novels and novellas in the horror genre, where she specialises in ghostly haunted houses, historical, gothic and witchy tales. Her latest novel is The After Death of Caroline Rand, described by one reviewer as having dream sequences, time travel, terrifying monks, and an attic space that will haunt your nightmares. Then we have got C.C. Adams. London native C.C. Adams credits his older brother with showing him the world of dark fiction and horror through books, TV and film at an early age. So I feel like this is a good story that we're going to hear more about in a minute. And he's published a selection of novellas, authored the collection Misery and Other Lines, and has also published a full-length novel titled Closure. And then we've got Wiles, or W.P. Wiles, author of the novels The Way In, Care of Wooden Floors and Plume. And next August, Salt is publishing a collection of his creepy fiction, The Anechoic Chamber and Other Weird Tales. So, not strictly a horror author, but with a creepy theme running through lots of fiction. So
Fantasy.
Yeah. And fantasy, yeah. So we'll come back to that idea in a minute. And then at the end we've got David Watkins, who writes fast-paced creature features. And his most recent release is St. Neath, which is not recommended for arachnophobes.
That's true.
Yeah. All right, so let's come back to Will, if I may. Let's talk about that idea of just building creepy elements into stories that are not perhaps necessarily under the banner of horror. So, how have you approached? Why did you do that? How have you approached that?
Why? Well, it was sort of the opposite of a deliberate strategy to begin with, in the sense that I thought at the beginning of my career that I wanted to be a serious novelist, and whenever I started writing a novel, weirdness would creep in and at the edges, and eventually I stopped fighting it. And in the first novel, which was in Care of Wooden Floors, which you mentioned, there was many steps, just a typical literary novel. I still find myself talking about horror comics in the course of the novel, and Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart and so on, and which was what a lot of my reading was. And when it came to writing my second novel, which is The Way In, which begins as a satire on business travel and then becomes sort of cosmic horror, when it becomes obvious that the hotel is far more than it seems, that was really just an effort to exasperate my then publisher by having a book that swerved genres halfway through. Since then, I suppose all my books have included strongly creepy, weird, supernatural elements. In Plume, there are ghostly cockatoos and a malevolent plume of smoke, hence the name. And Last Blade Priest, my fantasy novel, first of a series, it's got necromancy, skeletons, that sort of thing. So there was, I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it was by accident. It wasn't deliberate at all. It wasn't a strategy. It was the opposite of a strategy. I just found that was where things went naturally.
I know one of the things that we sometimes look for at Pseudopod is there's two things that we kind of talk about a lot. It's a sense of creeping dread and an eye for the unsettling, so unsettling things. So maybe anyone. How do you find those things? What do you see that kind of you think, oh, that's good, I'll build that in?
I think as far as, for me, creepy is very much what happens before the action happens. So you have something, an introduction, a feeling, it's engaging the senses, there's something not right, there's something going on in the shadows, something in the corner of your eye. This is something that's always fascinated me, and gripped me as well, right from the very first time I ever read my very first horror story, was this sense of something out of the ordinary, something wrong, something that shouldn't be there, and sustaining that, I think, is the challenge. Sustaining it, not revealing it, a bit like Hitchcock did with his films, and did with his films, which you start off and you show there's something there, there's a ticking, there's a time. Maybe it's a time, or maybe it's just a clock, we don't know, and then it's passed over for something else, and then something else is happening, but no, that's not right, but we don't know quite why it's not right yet. It's very much, I think, creeping dread, the whole art of creeping dread, is building that up without revealing too much, but playing on the mind, it's mind games with your readers, and creating word pictures, drawing on their imaginations, and really sort of leading your reader down a road without showing them very much at all. In fact, they're doing most of the work at that point. And I think the minute you then reveal the Babadook, or whatever it might be, that is the time when it stops being creepy and starts being something else, like what it really is, a monster, something gory, something funny, something nasty, something... Not at all. I can go on forever about that.
What about you, Cece? Because I read Seaman, and it's actually a book title. That's obviously a story where the horror is quite under the surface. I think. I mean, there's obviously something going on there. But what sort of things inspired you to put that?
The first thing is in light of things like the Me Too movement, and this is something I've been saying throughout the convention, that in so many ways as we as people and things change and things evolve, there's a greater sense of accountability, which is everything from the media that we consume in terms of film and TV to who is responsible for that. So just to use an example of, say, Get Out by Jordan Peele, you have black people in front of the camera, you have black people behind the camera, and audiences want more of that diversity. So with the Seaman novella, and yes, it is called Seaman, the idea is that a woman has a one-night stand. There's no shame in that, more power to her. But in terms of where someone is feeling powerless, how then does it feel if she starts leaking semen and she starts to wonder whether her partner was even human? So it is very much a psychological horror, and it's not, despite the title, it's not graphic in terms of bodily fluids, but it's the sense of something is not quite right. Now, you might be able to dismiss what you discover like the morning after, as in, well, there's a discharge, a one-off, fine, you might be able to dismiss it, but what if it keeps happening? What does that do to you? Especially in those quiet moments when you're not at the day job or you're not with your friends. You have those quiet moments where you really shouldn't spend too much time in your head. And that's where the creeping factor really comes into play.
Yeah, so it's kind of like it's your brain doing most of the work.
Exactly.
David, because your stories are more big creature features.
Yeah.
And I think it links to what Kat was saying here. If you reveal the monster too early, it becomes you lose that kind of that sort of creeping sense of unease. So maybe you could talk a bit about this. How do you balance it?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. I mean, I don't know. If you look at sort of classic monster films, so Jaws is always at the front of my mind whenever I'm writing something with a monster in it. Because Jaws, I don't know if anyone's watched it recently, the bit where the shark appears is awful. It's not just bad, it is awful. But it doesn't take away from what you've watched for the preceding hour and a half. You know, it's terrifying. So, much like Kat was saying, the more you can keep off page, I guess, for as long as you possibly can, that's perfect. But the balance also is, at some point, you characters have to realise what's going on, because there is nothing worse than when you're reading a book, watching a film, whatever, and you know it's like, oh, next door just started, you know, eating their kids. I think it's a zombie outbreak. No, don't be stupid. There's no such thing as zombies. It's zombies. For fuck's sake, come on. At some point, everyone's got to go. Yeah, we're dealing with zombies, and the tension of when do you reveal that and when do you not is quite crucial. So if I can just talk about myself for a bit, in my novel Exit Incident, I reveal it immediately. It's like within about 5 pages that you are dealing with monsters, it's going to be bad, and lots of people are going to die. And so I kind of chucked out all of that tension building because I wanted it to be fast-paced creature feature. And then with my latest one, St. Neath, I wanted to keep it hidden for as long as possible what was actually going on. And Adrian Baldwin, who did the cover, slapped it straight on the cover. It's a fantastic cover, so I'm not knocking Adrian at all, but it's like, can we maybe not put a massive fucking spider on the cover? Yeah, sorry about the time.
Yeah,
Sorry.
tiny bit of spoiler, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about like that balance between, you know, the building up, because the way in does actually do like this amazing job of, well, you talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, personally, speaking as a reader rather than a writer, first of all, you know, that tease is where all the pleasure is. You know, it's kind of you know, when you get into the sort of like the sort of third act of, you know, everything being resolved and you've got to defeat or not defeat whatever it is and so on. Then you know, whether you enjoy that or not all depends on how the tease has been handled. You know, how the build-up has been handled. And you know, personally, I like that to be kind of deferred and kept ambiguous as much as possible. I think, in terms of putting creepy elements in it, I mean, you know, it's. There's an interesting. I once went to an exhibition of things related to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and he researching before making The Shining, he had made this list of all characteristics of haunted houses and haunted hotels in other stories, and things like creaking floorboards and so on. And what's interesting about this list is, when he's going through reading other stories, is that none of them appear in The Shining. He's completely expunged them from The Shining. He's identifying things onto it. And I think fundamentally putting creepiness into novels, and this is where it can apply in almost any genre, is a sort of noticing. It's a picking up on a detail that perhaps you're not supposed to pick up on. Something very small often.
Yeah.
And then seeing it again, and that kind of it taking on a significance. You know, like a crack between tiles, or you know, an animal that might be slightly out of place or whatever, like for instance cockatoo. And then seeing it again. That kind of sense of it taking on significance possibly that no one else quite picks up on, and so on, is important. And that could be a and I think the identifying that evidence and bringing that out is part of the skill of writers I enjoy, is you know, when they pick up on something quite original for that sort of like noticing, that picking up on something that's out of place in the environment, or something that's in place but it's not, you know, they're noticing it a bit too much, or whatever, you know. It's a bit vague, but
It's not vague, I like it. I like it, picking up on tiny details that maybe freak you out a little. You know, is that guy following me? Is that bird following me? You know, all of that kind of thing. Anything that is out of the ordinary. And Tim Wagner, in his book Writing in the Dark, it's called, which is about like a how to write horror guide. And it's if you're looking to write horror, it's a great place to start. It's actually a really, really good book. And Tim Wagner is a very experienced horror writer, so he's worth listening to. And he said, take a look at something wholesome, something nice, next time you're walking down the street, next time you're going shopping, next time you're in a pizza place, whatever, and then go, what's wrong with it? And I think that's brilliant. You know, what's wrong? You know, you three are sitting there right now, what's wrong with you? How does it change, you know? What's wrong with one of you? You know, do you know what I mean? No, sorry. No. Let's move on quickly.
If I might just sort of talk to a related, specifically related to the environment we're now in, the way in is set in a chain of hotels, and what the protagonist is told to by another character to pay attention to is the art that's hanging on the walls, which is, you know, art. I mean, you think art is there to be looked at, but in chain hotels it's really not there to be looked at. It's there to be ignored. It's there for, you know, to create the impression that art's there. It's a sort of, and the carpets, and they and he starts noticing the art which he's not really supposed to notice at all, because it's meant to be so bland in the background.
This is not a Doctor Who panel, of course, but it reminds me of the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who, in the newer Doctor Who, which is possibly like the most terrifying monster ever created, I think. Surely people don't know, but if you don't know them, it's the idea they look like stone statues. They are those kind of statues of angels that you see in graveyards, and you know, particularly sort of seeing this in cities, and you don't pay any attention. You see statues, you walk past them, like you say, well, you know, you think it's there to be looked at, but you don't, because you're about your day. You just walk past it, you don't look at it. And the idea of them is that if you know, when you look at them, they don't move, but as soon as you stop looking at them, they come for you, right? So they, you know, it's just that day. And then I remember, I just never forget the end of that episode, where at the end there's all this footage of just statues that are all around in London, and just is like, oh God, I'm never walking past any of these ever again, and feel like, yeah. So it's just a sort of normal mundane things, and then, like you say, what might be wrong with it?
Yep.
What might it, you know, how might that be a threat? Whereas before I was just cheerfully ignoring it in about my day, and now suddenly I'm looking at this carpet thinking it looks a bit like tentacles.
There was
Thanks for that, Will.
An even worse one. In the 1980s, there was a 2000 AD story about wire coat hangers being actually the vanguard of an alien invasion force for strangling, stabbing, and so on. And saying, you know, look at the wire coat hangers in your cupboard. Do you remember how they got there? You know, were there always that many? And I've been thinking about that for about 30 years. That story.
Yeah, this is it. Things that just sort of creep their way into your life without you realising. Yeah. All right. Let's. I'll tell you. Kat, I read Cold Revenge.
Oh gosh.
And there was guilt was a big guilt and shame. I thought was were big themes in there. So I thought maybe you could talk a bit about using that to kind of inspire that. Because I remember I was reading some of it, feeling very uneasy. Like, cause it's nothing like feeling guilty. So it like doesn't upset your brain, is there? So.
Well, this is true. It's a long time since I've read Cold Revenge. Actually, it's even longer since I wrote it. Yeah, I mean the idea with Cold Revenge, each of the four 4 characters? Yeah. Each of the 4 characters that are in there have all done something that they really should not have done, seriously should not have done. And it all came out of a chance conversation I was having with my husband, who was sitting over there, one day when I said, oh yes, revenge is a dish best served cold. Hang on a minute, what if it was? So you have these people, and they've all got something to be ashamed of, really seriously ashamed of. And they're all brought together, they don't know each other from Adam, brought together in a stately type of home, historic house. And they got to have a lovely dinner, and the first course comes along. They've been somewhere or another, the hostess has been able to ascertain what their favourite starter is in all the world. And in each story is told in 4 different parts by the 4 different about the 4 different characters, and each one takes a bite of this, whatever it is their favourite dish, and that's when the thing good happens, folks. That's when revenge comes. And I think we all have this thing of, we want justice to be done, don't we? If somebody's done something really, really, really wrong, they cannot get away with it. They mustn't get away with it. And so building that in, when you've got this protagonist, I've got this protagonist who is, she is creepy because you never know anything about her. You never really find out until sort of further on into the story, if I remember right, exactly who she really is. In fact, you don't really do in the end, do you?
No,
you have a good idea. Yeah, you have a good idea, but she's a creepy sort of character that, how do we know this person? But she knows everything about each of them and what they've done, even though they've got these guilty secrets. And I think sort of building that in and building it up until each of them is hit by what they've done wrong when they take the first bite of their favourite starter in all the world. And I just love that contrast between something you really, really love and then retribution for something you've done really, really wrong that you shouldn't have done. So I think it's what we've really been talking about, this sort of contrast. A situation is like this, but then you throw something in which doesn't belong there, or it does belong, but not in that context. It doesn't. I think it is very effective. Just throw everything off kilter. So yeah, that's how I do it with Gold Revenge. And there you go.
Anyone else want to add? I feel like guilt and shame are very common themes in horror. So where have you kind of incorporated that into the work?
I mean, personally for me, I wouldn't say it's necessarily an element of guilt or shame. But for me, one of the devices I like to use when creating horror is who's ahead of the curve. So to come back to what you said earlier about something which is creepy, is something which might start in the shadows, but on top of that, you have what the reader knows and what the character knows. I like to play with who knows what and when. So generally it's the reader knows something that the character doesn't know yet. So it's a question of, well, that doesn't look right. And as you go through the stories, oh, this is getting worse, but the character doesn't know yet. And then by the time the character does find out, everything's already gone to hell in a handbasket. And again, to play with the idea of creep, it's once the spectacle is said and done, it's those quiet moments which for me is also where the creep really plays in, where a character has too much time in their own head, as in, this is what's happened. This is how things are now. What am I going to do? And that's the stuff I probably love to play with the most.
Yeah, I think the guilt and shame central themes to many horror stories, and they usually, particularly in short fiction, it turns that the person that you're reading about, that you're meant to be rooting for, has actually done something fairly horrific in the past, and the story is essentially their comeuppance. I quite like playing with that too. I'm quite determined at some point to write a really horrific story where the person it happens to is completely innocent of everything. Like, has never done anything wrong, ever. And horrible shit happens to them. That'd be great.
Now, I like how you mentioned that, because I know for fictitious.
I'm looking at you.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. But I have written one story which is about someone who has survived the fire where many others have died.
Right.
However, the entity in question that comes after this person has a misplaced sense of, you shouldn't have survived.
Right.
So even though our survivor, it's not their fault, but the entity doesn't care, they're still coming after them with a vengeance.
That's a terrific story.
Yeah, so it's kind of like survivor guilt made real.
In the worst possible way. If the character had something to feel guilty for, even on the smallest level, that's one thing, but he doesn't, and yet this entity is still coming for him and is relentless about them. You don't deserve to live.
That works brilliantly as a story, because that's kind of what guilt is like. Even just in day to day, guilt is a sort of I feel almost has a supernatural kind of element of being pursued by something that's kind of behind you, and you fear maybe getting closer at some point. That it's going to catch up with you. It's there's a that's obviously hugely fertile territory. It's because that's how it feels. It's like being pursued. I mean, in Plume, the character is a functioning alcoholic. His life is falling to pieces, and he's drinking more and more, and attempting to conceal his drinking, and the horrible blunders and deliberate things he's done wrong in work are catching up with him, and he starts seeing this black smoke on the horizon that's following him around, and it's a bit on the nose as metaphors go, but something's burning and it's getting closer. That's the Plume.
I think it was the Final Destination film series was very much like that, wasn't it? We had the people who survived that shouldn't have survived, whatever it was, the accident, the Ferris wheel or whatever, and gradually it will catch up with them, even though, as you said, they're innocent, they're totally innocent, but they were supposed to die then, and they didn't, and fate will not allow them to escape, or destiny or the universe or whatever, will not allow them to escape the fact that they should have died. So they didn't die then when they should, so they've got to die now. And I think there were 6 Final Destination films in there, weren't there? But they could work, the story was good, because the theme is a good one, and it's because you're sort of thinking, well, that's not fair, hell, they survived, they should be allowed to get on with their lives. We have this fairness thing, don't we? And it sort of gets a little bit upset when it's, but it makes for a good story. It really does make for a good story.
Not just you can't cheat death, more like, I won't let you.
Exactly.
Which is more ominous.
Yeah.
Well, you can cheat death, but then death will pound you.
It'll get you in the end.
Yeah, no friendly deaths. That makes me think of numbers. So then I'll get all the rules wrong. But the rules for horror from Squeam, which is the never. I'll be right back. The first person to have sex, they're definitely going to die, and all those kinds of things. But again, it feeds into that kind of guilt and shame thing, doesn't it? Because a lot of it is to do with doing things that perhaps are associated with guilt and shame. Yeah. All right, Cece, let's hear about your brother. He sounds like an interesting character. What did he show you, and how young were you, and how horrendously inappropriate was it?
Go on.
I mean, it was from as long as I could remember. For the most part, I would have been about maybe 5 years old, thereabouts. So as a child of the 70s and then going into the 80s, growing up with a lot of, if you like, the classic horror films, Raven, Scanners, The Evil Dead, The Exorcist, Poltergeist, that kind of stuff. Even now as I think about it, I can't remember whether the Omen books came before the films or whether the films came before the books, but all that kind of stuff. So I always had an appreciation for those dark narratives where, unlike, say, a rom-com, everyone lives happy ever after, or even happy for now. And certainly even for the stuff that I read, it wasn't anything which was like child-oriented, or should we say child-friendly. So those books were coming into the house, and I read them, and there's a genuine sense of threat that the bad shit can happen to anyone. Which is one of the reasons why I like horror. It's open season on everyone and everything. Good things happen, or rather bad things happen to good people. The monster sometimes gets away, which is one of the reasons why I love Halloween. Not necessarily for the whole film, but just that ending alone. So I got to the point where I was just truly damaged and I couldn't watch a horror film. So even when, and this is back in the days of the video recorder, yes, we're going back that far. So when my brother would hire films, they're two older brothers, I'm the youngest, the two of them would watch downstairs and I would sit up in my room and I'd be waiting until the horror had stopped and they said it was safe to come down. So yes, this is what I mean when I say I was damaged. But I just love horror stories. So even though I can't watch them now, I love reading them and I definitely love writing them. So I have this genuine aesthetic. It's not enough that there is horror on the page. The shit I write, it has to be disturbing. If it unsettles you, if it scares you, if it really scares the shit out of you, I've done my job. So I approach with that sensibility of, it's not enough to be just like horrific. It has to scare you. And I write with that mindset.
So how do you do that?
The idea of creeping, as it were, is part of it. The idea that something in this picture is not quite right. And then to play with the idea that, yes, something is not quite right, but the reader knows, the character doesn't. So the reader gets the sense that this, horror, whatever it is getting worse. Sometimes I'll swap it the other way around, that the character is aware of something and the reader doesn't know.
Yeah.
But I don't always maintain that all the way through. And then there are some moments which are just left field, like There Goes Pretty, for example. Like a character just rolls over in the night and she comes face to face with a ghost. There's no build-up, there's no harbinger or anything like that. It's just there.
So you've mentioned endings. I mean, one of the things that I see when I read a lot of short fiction in submissions is I see people who want to be nice to their characters, right? And one of the things I end up saying as an editor quite often is, this is great, but you need to just be really horrible to everyone at the end, right? And I'm wondering if people have examples of that where you have, maybe you've written something and you've got, actually, I need to change that ending around.
Frequently.
Tell us about it. Yeah.
It goes into spoilers, really, doesn't it?
Without telling us the ending.
Yeah, if you start talking about the endings of your story, you just ruined it. So I've just saved yourself, just saved you a tenner. There you go. You can, I think, in horror, I think a lot of the times, you know, everybody dies at the end, or everybody's in a really bad place at the end. And I don't think horror always has to end like that. I think it can end on a note of hope. as long as you don't do that every single story, every single time, so that you catch people unawares. So, Exeter Incident, I know there's a couple of people in the room who've read it. The original ending to that was an awful lot bleaker than the way it ended up. And given that just about everybody who lives in Exeter dies in that book, it gives you an idea of everyone died, and I had to come back from that and sort of end it on a note of hope, because otherwise it was, people were going to spend 400 pages and then come away really miserable and never buy anything by me again. So, couldn't do that.
I'm a great fan of the twisted ending. I love to twist.
Yeah.
So you think, I love to read a twist and I love to write a twist. So you think you got it sussed as a reader, and hopefully as a writer you made it so. Yeah, however bad or whatever may be good or even hopeful, the ending is likely to be, oh yes, it's building up to this, and this is going to happen, and that's good. Yeah, I can see where this is going to end. And then, it didn't end like that. I mean, I have one, I'm not going to say which book, but I have one where you think that the main character has actually now put the worst of everything behind her. And she's finally, after everything she's been through, she's going to get, okay, it's not going to be great, but she's going to have some kind of a life, and then she kills herself. What? Wasn't expecting that. So, I love to twist it. Okay, that's an extreme one that I did. But I love to twist it in some way or another so that you've got an ending. And also, hopefully, okay, that one is obviously a final ending, the character kills herself. In most cases, I don't quite make it that full, I don't make it that final. I leave it so there's a twist, and the reader is left with one of maybe two or no more than about 3 choices, but probably 2 choices, 2 directions that the story could then go on. It doesn't, because it's the end. But they can then make their own mind up about that ending. And either way would be it's their way. It's right for them. And so I do like to put the unexpected in at the end, and just
I think what you say about being meaner to your characters, strengthening a story is, I mean, although it's not a horror story, my very first novel was about a man looking after a flat and steadily getting drawn into a more and more nightmarish situation of things going wrong and him trying to put things right and that only making things worse. And it ends with there's a lot of sort of like cleaning related mishaps in it, and it ends with him being involved in a tussle with another character in the kitchen, and that other character falling over onto the open drawer of a dishwasher where there's knives in it, and getting stabbed.
Are you sure you're not a horror writer?
Well, you see, it had a way of getting into it. I used to get these. I used to work in a job where I got these emails from the Royal Society for Prevention of Accidents, where it said, "Did you know that 3,000 people are killed every day by falling onto the open drawers of dishwashers," or something like that. Anyway, but anyway, in the first draft of the story, this character didn't die. It was a horrible incident at the end of the story, and so on. And my agent said, they have to die. It's just, it doesn't have the proper dramatic beats without them dying. They have to die, and he was absolutely right, I'm afraid. And I felt dreadful about having to kill off this character and making the other character basically a murderer. But it was a much stronger story for it. Sorry, the book's been out for a while, so I don't think it counts as a spoiler. But yeah, that does happen. Although he also kills a cat, quite accidentally, and that's much less popular. People hate that.
No, that's true. That's true. We have we have stuff in the submission. We have a specific tag for bad things happen to animals, because people are quite happy for humans to die in gruesome, bloody ways. So if somebody's killed a cat or a dog, it's like, oh dear.
Yeah, no one cares about the caretaker, but the cat. Oh dear.
That's right. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I know what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the importance of white space. So I'm just thinking of it in terms of a horror novel, particularly, cannot just be unrelenting. And we sort of touched on this, but it can't be unrelenting action, right? So you have to, what I'm thinking about is how do you manage that balance between you've got kind of this quiet period, there has to be these quiet beats in there in order for the reader's imagination perhaps to catch up. And so how do you manage that without it possibly getting boring? How do you get that balance? What do you think about that balance?
Yeah, I think, again, in my case, what I tend to do is if I'm having something like that going on, there will still be, you know, the characters can perhaps be having a conversation about something, or they're having dinner, or whatever they're doing, or moving from one room to another, or they're exploring something, or whatever. But then there's just something, again, that's not quite right. We're back to the creeping dread again, but because I love creeping dread. There is something that's still not quite right, but it's not actively doing anything. It's the picture on the wall, and it's catching the attention of the character, but they're looking at the picture, yeah, just a picture, and moving on, and having this conversation. But then, I think something that has been mentioned is that all of a sudden, you put something in that they weren't expecting, and that brings the reader back to some sudden action, like a kind of written jump scare, really. Something that they weren't expecting. So something maybe comes out of this picture, or they just when they're having a conversation about, oh, so-and-so was saying that this was going on, or that was going on. I think when you're having the downtime as well for your characters, I think although they are having a conversation or they are exploring, it's got to still be within the boundaries of achieving the objective of the story, if you like. So if they are I'm thinking of this Caroline Randa, the latest story I've written, or the latest one that's been published, where they're in this house, Canterbury Manor, and they're exploring, or two of the characters are exploring a particular room that they shouldn't really be in, but they're there. They shouldn't be in there in the first place, so there's always a feeling that they're going to get found out. But they're within that context, they're finding things and whatever. But everything that they find is actually relevant to something that's going to happen later. So you kind of laying little clues out, a bit like Agatha Christie. You're laying some clues to something, so that although it's downtime, nothing drastic is happening. There's still little clues there and little crumbs you're laying down for them, which will come to fruition later on in the story. And I think as a writer, one of the things that you've got to, the challenge that we all have, is to make sure you don't leave any of those dangling around when they should be actually tied up. So that's not to say about writing. No, the book isn't written, it's written, and half of it is picking up the bits the trails that you laid early on. But yeah, I think have downtime, but it should be with relevance.
Anyone else want to go?
I think the trick is to not make it boring.
Yeah.
You know, you've just done this massive chase scene, ghost scene, scary scene, whatever, and then everyone's just sitting around having dinner or loading their horrific dishwasher or whatever. And you need to just keep an eye on the overall arc of it, and you know that downtime is important. If you ever watch a film and it's action from minute 1 to minute 120, it's boring.
It's boring.
So you need those downtimes to make the up times hit harder.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I read something recently which said that in any given book or film, you should have a maximum of 3 set pieces, which was quite interesting, because the rest of it you won't remember. And it's almost the journey between those set pieces. And I'm not sure I agree with that, but you definitely need the trough of the roller coaster, if you like, to go with the highs. And getting that right is really tricky. So if anyone's got any tips, I'm around after the panel.
Yeah, the moments of respite are really important for readers, and actually thinking about some stories, they can be my favourite story. I mean, I love classic haunted house stories, and often the bits I love are when the characters, you know, essentially everything all is well. They're drawing themselves up in their room, you know, the fire's in the grate and so on, and nothing's quite gone wrong yet. And you need that respite in order to, you know, then, you know, violate that respite.
Yes.
You know, that. I mean, I'm thinking of the Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson. There's a scene at the beginning, which is actually one of my favourite scenes, where all the characters are together, they're in the study, they're trying to make a base and feel safe in this place, and they're sharing why they're there together. And that's actually a lovely scene. I really like that. And knowing that they've all got to go off to their horrible bedrooms is you know, they're just gathered there briefly it makes it a very good thing. And then that's later got the classic sort of violation of respect. Oh God, it's possible I'm looking up stories, and please jump in if I am. But where there are two characters in the bedroom together and being frightened by what's going on, and they hold hands, but it's not the hand.
Oh
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that's good bit of violating respite there.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of what I was rather ineptly trying to say, that you have, you know, things sort of fine, but it's not fun, but it's sort of fun. But then, yeah, you have that hand. And I think it comes out well in the film versions as well, especially the original film version of it, you know, where the main character is actually the narrator of the film, as well as being featured into it. So whose hand was I holding?
It's one of the great moments.
That's lovely.
All right, I'm conscious of time, so does anyone have any questions? Yes.
So the question is relating to when you're spending a lot of time developing these dark themes and creepy stories, how do you protect yourself and your own mental health and psyche as you're diving really deep into the dark?
Who said we have?
You know, it is a bit of a funny, it's kind of a bit of a trope, but it does also seem to be true that horror writers are all the most lovely, sunny, happy people. And it's a bit of a joke online. You look it up, you'll find kind of cartoons, and it's sort of like the science fiction writer and the fantasy writer, and then the horror writers are all kind of flowers and rainbows. they're all like, they write awful things, but they're all very happy. So I think there might be something in it. It's quite cathartic. Yeah. Like, horror writers have dealt with all their trauma by giving it to you. So that's kind of how you are.
I'm doing another panel after this one, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. But there was a study done in America quite recently, and they found 300 Americans, so you know it's probably quite a balanced viewpoint already. And they asked them how they coped with the pandemic, and they found that the people who liked horror and the people who had morbid curiosity handled the pandemic really, really well, because it was never as bad as, you know, The Stand. Yeah. So, well, that's okay, you know. I didn't see Randall Flagg or Abigail sitting on her porch, so I was quite happy, you know. I don't know, I think you look into it and you know how bad things can get, and we're not there, so it's okay.
I agree with that. And there's a couple of stories of mine. One is a novel, In Darkness, Shadows Breathe, and I went through medical. I had cancer, put it that way. And I went through surgery and all the rest of it that goes along with that, as anybody who's been there will appreciate. So, and I wrote it out in Darkness, Shadows Breathe, and we're talking about cathartic. It's just immediately hit the thing, because that is one of my darkest books, In Darkness, Shadows Breathe. And as a result of writing that, I found that I felt more at peace mentally with what I've been through. And another, just briefly, I know we're getting pretty very short time, a novella of mine, which is coming out in print soon, it's called Dark Avenging Angel, is about another, or inspired by another part of my life, which I found exceptionally difficult to deal with, because it goes right back to my childhood, and sort of for about until I was in my mid-20s. And I find I've always carried this burden with me, and I wrote it out in Dark Avenging Angel. Okay, what happens? It's different. My life was different to the characters. But essentially, the elements, I brought them out in Dark Avenging Angel. And ever since writing that out, I've actually found it much easier to come to terms with that really dark stuff that was going in my head. So protecting myself, I protected myself by writing it in the first place. And they're two stories of which I'm probably some of the ones I'm most proud of.
I had precisely that problem with Plume, which is a very dark and personal story about alcoholism and so on, and addiction, and the way that ultimately, because I was very blocked and quite miserable writing it, I'm very glad that I wrote it in retrospect, because it did feel cathartic afterwards, but it was during, it was horrible. Was writing something else. I got started on another book and was able to go off and take breaks from it, and that was my subsequent novel, the fantasy novel, which is on sale here. And so that was, having two projects gave me kind of like a way of breaking away from it.
I mean, I never really found the process of writing horror to be cathartic for some inner ill, but for me it's the idea of villainy taken to not necessarily a more extreme, but a more insidious level. And I usually use the example of The Lion King, which is, in part at least, based at a universal audience, and there are children involved, but that doesn't stop Scar from murdering his brother. Mm-hmm. So villainy is a chance to be really creative with your narrative and take it to darker places, more terrifying places. And then to come back to what I said earlier, it's not enough that I write a good story. I would like to write something that scares you, so that's what I will do. So from a creator's point of view, if there's catharsism, that's where I get it. That it will truly engage someone and move someone and hopefully scare the shit out of someone.
Yes, go
on. You talk about like creeping dread and scaring people, and do you feel like there is a difference between the creepy and the scary and different ways of achieving that kind of feeling in your writing?
I'd say that creepy can be scary, but scary isn't necessarily creepy. And I say this from the point of view of some of the scares I use might be called jump scares, for want of a better way of putting it. And some of the scares are more of that creeping dread, that something is not quite right. And in some of the scares, there is something horribly wrong. It's not necessarily blood and gore and violence, but it's to see how wrong something is. Like, to use an American Werewolf in London as an example, part of what sells the scene, regardless of Rick Baker's effects, is the fact it's down to David Norton's performance. He really does not believe he's changing into a werewolf, but nothing short of a bullet is going to stop that.
on.
This is a question for Dave. You mentioned you recommended a book earlier about writing horror. What was the name of that book?
It's
Writing in the Dark.
Writing in the Dark.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Tim Wagner.
Tim Wagner, Writing in the Dark. There's an exercise book that goes with it as well, but you really don't need that. You can just get the Writing in the Dark. It's got exercises at the end of every chapter, and it's got quotes from some of the best horror writers working today in it as well. It's highly recommended.
Any more questions? Oh yeah, go on.
What is the single scary story that you
That I've read.
Yeah.
Read.
I mean,
anyone.
Yeah. What is the story that stands out for you as like the scariest thing that you've read?
Oh, read. Well, in my case, I think I would say at the time I read it, it was The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty, which affected me so badly when I was reading it. I mean, this was years ago, I have to say. I've become a bit more inured to it, but it was so bad. When I read it, I had to immediately give the book away because I was scared stiff. I don't know why, it didn't make any sense at all, but I didn't want this book in the flat because for some reason it was cursed. It was something nasty was going to happen to me because this book was in the flat. Don't ask me why. I was very young at the time.
You know what? I can't remember the name of the author. I should probably name all your stories shenanigans, but no, Alex Hoflick from Pseudopod sent me a story specifically to read the other day because he was considering it for publication, and I think I'd probably say if I said the title was Sleep Study. It's set in a sleep study lab, and I think I read short horror all day every day because that's my job. But I was like, thanks for that, Alex, because it was the most terrifying thing I've ever. Yes, we should run this one. Yeah, it's like but I think it kind of does feed into what we've been saying of that. It's that kind of very mundane and what should be a very safe environment, right? Because it's a lab, right? And there's a scientist, and everything's very safe, and there are all these machines, and it should be that nothing possible. What could happen, right? There's security, there are doors, but it goes wrong. So yeah. I mean, without giving anything away. So I think that's probably what it is. It's that kind of it's when you take that situation that should be safe, it should be fine, everything should be fine, but you know it's not fine. You know it's going to go horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. That's the stuff of.
For me, it would be Adam Neville's. Oh Christ, the name's gone.
The Ritual?
No,
No
one gets out alive. No one gets out alive. It's a 600-page novel. To this day, I don't know how he did it. It's absolutely terrifying from page 1.
So it's called No One Can.
No one gets out alive. Again, you could do worse if you're an aspiring horror writer to really study the first chapter of that book. This is just a woman moving into a hostel. That's it. And it's,
The story, our time is up, so I'll be very quick. But the story that scared me the most at an impressionable age, maybe not the scariest, but it was the one I remember scaring me the most, was The Mist by Stephen King. It had such a profoundly bleak ending. It freaked me out for a long time.
I have to pick Incubus by Joe Donnelly, which has the tagline, "What kind of baby would steal a mother?" And the answer to that question, I can say for all the stuff I've ever read, it is the only book that made my skin crawl. And that was when I read it in the daytime. It's nasty.
There's some faces out there that are really lit up at this conversation, and there are others who are going, "Oh my God, no, I'm not going anywhere near that."
If I catch you good people beyond this, I'll gladly show you the book cover so you can go and find it. But it is one of my all-time favorite books. It really, really made my skin crawl. It's that good.
All bad.
Right, Brett, thanks. We could just sort of thank everybody. Thank you very